Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another chat with your co-hosts, Pastor Connor Longafee and myself, Pastor Roland Weisbrot. We're looking forward to another chat today. We have decided to discuss ecclesial polity, which of course nobody has any opinions on and is always a very agreeable topic that never causes any division in any churches or church bodies. And so because there's a lot of conversations across North America, I would even say, regarding ecclesial polity, whether or not we should have bishops, whether or not there should be a decentralized sort of congregationalist system, whether it should be an Episcopal system, whether it should be mixed. What do the confessions say? What does the Bible say? All of these things are being debated, and there's a variety of Lutheran bodies in North America who have taken different approaches. And so, because this is such a lively discussion, both in the parish level, I would say, but also at the sort of synodical or association level, we thought it was worthwhile to have that conversation today and consider the different attributes, the different points of view, shall we say, the flaws, but also the benefits of different ways of doing things. And of course, all in light of what we read in the scriptures and in the confessions, and of course, what we can glean from our church fathers as well. So that's going to be kind of the basis of our discussion today. So we're looking forward to that. And I guess we'll see where it goes. I'm not sure that Connor and I even fully agree on this, mostly because, my own personal experience has been colored by what I have seen and gone through, both as a congregant prior to my ordination and also as an ordained pastor in different ecclesial organizations. And so I perhaps have been pushed in one way or another just because of my experiences. So I'm sure we'll have a great conversation today, and I can't wait for this.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation regardless of what synod an individual is coming from. Many will know and understand that Pastor Roland and I used to be in the same synod, and now we are not in the same synod, but I'm in the synod that he used to be in. So there's a lot of touch points that we have, and also a kind of dynamic nature to our experiences here, even though there's of course that great shared overlap. But whether we have, somebody that we're talking to that's in the ELCiC or ELCA, and they're going to have this idea of, what they would call canonical bishops, with this supposedly, line of succession going all the way back to the apostles, which I don't think is not true, but I just think it's a little bit silly when it's like some like gay trans person that's crippled in 5 limbs and all this stuff, and then it's apostolic succession of somebody that identifies as the gender that they are not born as. I think it's a little bit ridiculous. However, the uncouth remarks aside, they're going to be coming at this ironically from what is probably conceived as the most traditional Catholic position imaginable. And what I think is super interesting about this is, obviously we're going to, get into, the Book of Concord's text about this and the biblical text about this. Ironically, what I think is funny so when you look at the Book of Concord and you look at the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, Article 14, where it says that the Roman Catholics had accepted Article 14 with the caveat that they stick with the canonical ordination. What they were referring to was something very similar. Obviously, it's different in the regard to gender and sexuality and this stuff, but it was that which the ELCiC and the ELCA are talking about, which is very funny when you realize that the most conservative synods of Lutheranism in North America do not share this, right? They might say that they have bishops, and I would say that they do have bishops in my own way of understanding that, but not in the way that the ELCA or ELCiC have that, right? So in a very amusing sort of situation, the most traditional position that you can possibly have on polity is held by the most liberal groups. And ironically, the most radically schismatic, sectarian, conservative synods of Lutheranism in North America hold to what is definitely the most non-traditional, unorthodox position on polity to the extent of even getting rid of the pastoral office, right? Which is at that point conserving nothing whatsoever, right? So you have this kind of absurdist reality that we're living in, which also makes it harder to discuss. And then you get things that, people are flying off the rails and failing to think about this cool-headedly, right? So they start talking about, even for example, with the last conventions and the upcoming LCMS convention, people talking all the time about the term bishop. Should we bring in the higher church thing? Should we do the chanting? And then people start saying, well, chanting is used by the ELCA. We can't do it. Well, the robes are worn by the ELCA. We can't do it. Well, the traditional term of bishop is used by the ELCA. We can't do it. Ironically, those are traditional things that have no place in the ELCA, right? And the conservatives have been rejecting them for years and years and years because they're held by liberals, which, again, it makes no sense. So I think it makes for a really interesting discussion because we are living in such interesting and exciting times in which nothing makes sense and everything is backwards.
Well, and I think this is only further complicates the whole conversation because a lot of synods, whether they want to admit it or not, have the position they have as a response to another synod's position rather than a theological, doctrinal, or historical theology position, right? Like, even as you said, there's a lot of people in the LCC, LCMS that don't want to use terminology or move towards a polity employed by the ELCIC, ELCA, not necessarily because of theological concerns or doctrinal concerns, but simply because they use it, right? Which is, of course, not a good, in my view, that's not a good reason not to do something. But this is so often what happens. And I think one of the places that perhaps we can start looking into the Canadian sort of history of this a little bit too is go back to the origination of the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations. So a lot of people don't realize that the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations, also known as CALC, CALC, started in the 90s by a bunch of individuals who were concerned about the merger between the Anglican Church of Canada and the ELCIC, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and in particular, the insistence that was contingent upon the merger by the Anglican camp that all of the Lutheran pastors would have to be reordained in the apostolic succession, otherwise they would be considered as having invalid orders. So CALC was born.
And this was also, I'll just say, this was also the concern, and I think it was 2003 of the LCMC forming.
Yes. Which is funny because a lot of people think these organizations were born out of the debate on gay marriage, but they actually weren't. They were born out of the debate over who has valid orders and what makes a pastor, what makes a valid call, all those sorts of questions. Now, of course, it became about gay marriage later. Well,
and we also need to make the one caveat: the NALC did come out just on that debate on morality. So that last group is the one that stuck in there until the end when the ethical issues came in, and then they left. But they took with them much of the rest.
Yes, which is an interesting point because what CALC and LCMC ended up taking out of the ELCIC and ELCA respectively was a lot more of the low church, pietistic, evangelical-minded congregations that their entire identity was threatened by the idea that, the pastors that they had commissioned would now no longer be considered valid orders because they wouldn't submit to this sort of new system demanded by the Episcopal Church in the States and the Anglican Church of Canada in Canada. And so this is a very interesting thing to consider, these polity questions. Now, the responses to these things were very different. CALC and LCMC responded to the attempt to centralize more power and authority in the office of the bishop by basically adopting a radically decentralized, congregationalist-focused sort of polity, where essentially what functionally ends up happening is each congregation is an island unto itself. Its pastor and council are the masters, and they choose voluntarily to associate with the wider association, whether it be CALC or LCMC. But those associations, CALC and LCMC, have no right to come in and say how they're supposed to do things or anything. Thus, the only recourse CALC and LCMC have to punish a congregation that's going into error is to kick the congregation out of the fellowship. There is no way to go in and remove the pastor. You can ask, you can be like, you can come out and be, would you please remove the pastor? Would you please remove the pastor? And of course, the answer is 9 times out of 10, no, because at the end of the day, the pastor tends to have the relationships of power necessary in the congregation, where a lot of times, for instance, even in CALC, there's been instances where they've tried to remove people, pastors, and the congregation just simply says no, because it's like, who are you, Mr. President? I've never even met you before. And you're telling us you want to kick out our pastor that we love, right? And so anyway, long story short, the CALC and LCMC answer to the centralization of power that happened, especially even more so after the sort of full communion between the Anglicans and the Lutherans, ended up being a radically decentralized ecclesial polity, which comes with the disadvantages of really no way of enforcing doctrinal compliance, orthodoxy, pastoral standards, really anything. However, on the flip side, it has allowed creative churches to be more perhaps entrepreneurial in the way they do things, to try new things, to have flexibility to do things that perhaps some more top-down polities wouldn't allow. And I have to say this because I am a benefactor of that. I was able to be ordained, installed. I was able to do different things here at the church I'm serving because of that freedom. Now, I think that has been a benefit to the church I'm serving. However, I freely admit it has been a disaster for other churches in these organizations, and I have firsthand seen that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing, what happened with the CALC situation. But when I think about this, I don't think about it as, and everybody that knows me knows that I really don't like congregational polity whatsoever. And we'll get into why that is, but this synod started in 92, and when it started up until early 2000s, oftentimes you'll hear the year 2007 thrown out, and for good reason, right? That's when there was a vote on the floor at convention to start letting in congregations that were from the ELCiC that didn't want the rest of what was going on there, without actually changing their position to align it with CALC's earlier position on women's ordination. Now, however the listener feels about women's ordination is irrelevant to the question, though I can imagine the positions of our listeners on women's ordination. I'm pretty sure I would know what it is. However, regardless of how you feel about that, the real issue here is that they had voted to welcome people without actually asking that they align with the position of the synod, right? And then they changed the synod's position afterward, hastily, right? And so you have this precedent then of allowing people in with a disagreement on the synod's policy. So it's not just that they weren't removing pastors. This happened like that. The synod was fine at that point. And then they started making these decisions. Let's let in people who disagree with us. Well, that's not going to stop at women's ordination. When people start getting high on the numbers, right? Oh, wow, we got another congregation. Wow, we got another congregation. This is neat. Let's let in some of the Reformed from South Africa, let's say. Wow, now we get in more people. Wow, let's start letting in some Baptists now who've been fired. Wow, our numbers are higher now. Wow, let's start letting in Pentecostal. Let's start getting in some Messianic rabbinic rabbis, Messianic Jewish rabbis. Who would do that? Well, CALC did that, right? And these are nice guys, but it's like, well, you have no place in a Lutheran synod. You fundamentally have no reason to be there, right? And the congregations, oftentimes if you speak to them, they would say they didn't even know why Lutheranism was important if you talk to them now, this is of course more than 10 years after, right? More than 10 years after, these congregations have not been pastored by a Lutheran pastor for over a decade. They no longer know anything about Lutheranism. They no longer care either, right? Because for them, they've had pastors and been loved by pastors and love pastors of all different persuasions, right? And so what CALC has become is not just congregationalist, it's just multi-confessional in the way that, for example, the United Church of Canada would be, except CALC is a lot more conservative than the United Church of Canada. And I want to make that statement because this is not entirely the fault of the congregationalism. Because before 2007, it was fine, right? I mean, it's still not my ideal, but it was fine. And then, you look at these Baptist congregational associations. These are also hyper-congregationalist associations. And they, like CALC, refuse to call themselves synods, although I'm still going to call both of them synods anyways, right? If you're not a Baptist in the Baptist association, you don't get to stay. That's not just if you're a pastor. That's also if you're a layman. And if the congregation's letting in Presbyterians or Anglicans into the Baptist church, that church will be removed like that, right? And so it is true. We can say their only way to punish, so to speak, and they wouldn't even view it as punish, right? But the only way to punish or discipline, so to speak, is to remove the congregation. But they do it readily, hastily, fast, right? And the reason they do it is because, in part because they don't view it as punishment. They view it as necessary, right? But when a congregational association or a synod no longer views doctrinal unity as essential to the church's association or the church's synod in its constitution and its essence, well, then it doesn't matter. And what I think is still interesting about this is CALC never removed that from the Constitution. Mm-hmm. If you read CALC's Constitution, it's right there. It's right there. It says that for congregations to be in CALC and for pastors to be in CALC, they have to have unity on the church's confession of faith, right? And this, when you ignore your constitution, then your synod does not have a constitution, so you don't have a synod, right? So there's a lot of like moving parts here. But when I think of decentralization, I don't necessarily think of it in a disunified way. But I would think of it in the sense of it can be as good or as bad as everybody wants it to be, right? The only difference with a centralized and a decentralized sort of association there is, let's say go back in time and we're both in CALC together, and I'm the only high church guy there, and let's say nobody else is chanting the verba, and then everybody says chanting the verba is heretical or whatever. So that, not that they would do this, but let's say that they did, right? In a decentralized association, they would all have to have unanimity and have a majority vote to then say, okay, we're going to remove this congregation because it's walking a different way. Whereas in a centralized one, it wouldn't matter if you have a majority vote. It would matter who the elected officer is, right? And I really do see why there is a desire for that decentralization, to have that majority vote. Because if you elect the wrong guy, as people would say, then it can go wrong. And I'm not so favorable to that argument, but what I am more favorable to is, where does the Spirit work, right? And obviously, when you look at these centralized polity formats, you're looking at mostly these people who say that the Spirit revealed that he was going to speak through like a couple guys, right? Rather than the Spirit is going to speak through the whole church. It's a very different picture. And there is an argument to be made, definitely, of both. So,
just finishing up the conversation on CALC in particular, one of the things that I think CALC either benefited from or harmed it, depending on perspective, with the 2007 situation and the mass exodus of churches from the LCMC, there was very much a desire to get these churches, of course, but I think CALC, in a sense, suffered from what often happens to franchises that expand too rapidly, right? I'm sure the first McDonald's was a great restaurant. I'm sure even the first 20 McDonald's were great restaurants, maybe even the first 100. But by the time you get to the 10,000th or 15,000th McDonald's, the quality inevitably starts to dip. And some franchise owners are better, some are worse, some quality is better, some teams are better, but quality control becomes harder. And especially when you adopt a posture of, maximal growth, we'll sort out the details later. And that's essentially what CALC, for better or worse, opted for. Fine, that's history, that's what it is. Now the question becomes, for the future of CALC, and this is something that is more of my concern as someone still in CALC, I think one of two things needs to happen. And then I want to move on to conversations of other polity systems and whatnot. But one of two things needs to happen in CALC. We either need to actually follow our own constitution, or we need to be honest about what we actually are. Right? And I want to see one of those two paths for CALC. I don't even necessarily
care. The Constitution or change the Constitution.
Yes. I don't even necessarily care which one they choose at this point. My point is, either we need to be honest about what we actually are as CALC and change the Constitution and make ourselves the Canadian Lutheran or the Canadian Association of Broadly Protestant Congregations. Fine, whatever. Or we need to actually do the whole L thing in CALC. And basically I think that's the precipice that CALC is now sitting on as we come into a new election cycle for a president. And I think this next president is essentially going to show which way we're going to go. Are we going to embrace the big tent, the broadly Protestant thing, or are we going to go and actually say, actually, we have a constitution, and actually it says something, and actually it means something, and we're going to do that. But I think what I don't like is I feel like there's some disingenuous attribute to CALC claiming to be something on paper, but being something else in reality. And I believe the congregations should have the choice to plainly be faced with the fact of what we are, and then choose whether or not they still want to associate with it. Because there's a huge difference between CALC on paper and CALC in practice. And congregations should be able to make a choice whether or not they want to commit to CALC on paper or CALC in practice. And if we choose CALC in practice, then the paper needs to change. Conversely, if we choose CALC on paper, then the practice needs to change. And that would be my, for whatever it's worth, opinion on that topic. And but once again, what's so hard about this is the only way to do this inevitably would be the mass removal of a lot of people and a lot of congregations.
And and not to lift a blanket and unveil my father's nakedness, but I don't think that that's possible. I think that when you tell most people, it's one thing if you have to amputate an arm. It's a different thing if you have to amputate two arms. And I don't know how widely understood the ratio of Lutheran to non-Lutheran pastors is in certain associations. There's really only one association that allows variance on this. But if you amputate half your body, you're dead.
Well, and to be honest, just picking up on what you're saying, I think the board is already set.
I think that the board is set
has already been played out. Yeah. And I think what's most likely is CALC will just sort of have to embrace we're a broadly Protestant organization or a fellowship of churches. And like I said, fine, but let's be honest about that instead of the veneer of Lutheranism, because there are I don't want to speak more on that, otherwise I'll probably get into saying things I shouldn't.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and I'm more free to say things, not that I need to say them, but if you elect a president and it's not a Lutheran, I don't think that that's when you stop being Lutheran. I think, and everybody's always known my position on this, so I'm not afraid to say it. The moment that you tolerate a non-Lutheran, you're not Lutheran, right? That doesn't mean, you shall not, suffer a witch to live kind of thing, but it's an inviting non-Lutherans into Lutheran pulpits and inviting non-Lutherans to celebrate the Eucharist at Lutheran altars and calling non-Lutheran pastors to pastor Lutheran churches shows a deep lack of understanding with how the Lutheran tradition has always seen doctrine and doctrinal unity as necessary to church fellowship rather than as secondary to, if we can have it, we'll have it kind of thing, which is very much like an evangelical Protestant idea, right? Where you see all of these Presbyterians and Baptists and Wesleyans and Methodists, they will, while they will not allow you to join the church, they will allow you to swap pulpits and to preach as a visiting guy, right? The Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones preaching in, pulpits that he was not of the tradition of, and Charles Spurgeon preaching in Presbyterian churches, and all of these kinds of things. These were not uncommon to happen, but that's because there was very much a shared unity in doctrine among themselves already, which we don't actually share with them. And I don't think that a lot of people who are, less in touch with Lutheran history and theology are that aware of, right? A lot of them would say, Luther, he's the first Protestant guy, Calvin's the Protestant guy, we're all the same, right? And, what viewers of this podcast will know that's not true. That's never been true. They never viewed themselves as similar, definitely not the same. So there is something else going on here. But just before we move on, just while we're doing, and it is a very good example, I think, of congregational and decentralized polity. But I think we would be amiss if we didn't talk, for the sake of the listener and also for the sake of clarity, what actually is congregational polity?
Well, I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, when essentially what it ends up being is the congregations, when they gather, become the supreme authority, right? And so essentially it becomes a bit of a tyranny of the majority. So if all the congregations and their delegates and their pastors came together at a convention and said that white is black and black is white and voted on that, then it would be so, right? And of course, yes, there's a constitution, but as we all know, constitutions and bylaws are only as valuable as they are enforceable or chosen to be enforced. And so, yes, of course, hypothetically, even associations that are highly congregationalist still have certain standards that they hold themselves to. But once again, that entirely depends on whether or not that's enforced and actually followed and valued. Now, the thing that's interesting in the congregationalist setting is basically everything becomes a democratic vote. How money is spent, democratic vote. What doctrines are accepted or rejected, democratic vote. Who's added to the roster, who's not, democratic vote. All of these things become democratic votes. Highly decentralized, highly sort of very large franchise, so to speak, voting base. And that basically sets all the rules, all the opinions, all the expenditures, everything. And it becomes essentially, it mirrors our democratic systems here in North America and in the West more broadly, as in essentially majority rule.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying that it's led by votes and it's mirroring the secular world, which is not, in my mind, that's not painting a very pretty picture. However, I think a good way that I like to look at this is when we start talking about different ecclesiologies, there's a great question here of where do we start, which tends to frame not just the outcome, but the whole shape of the theology and the ecclesiology. So do we start with, I'll say there's generally three options here. You can start with God, and that can either mean like exemplarist thought, or it can mean, saying like, what is in God himself? What is he himself? And then let's mirror that. Or saying, what does he say in his word, and going straight to the scriptures. The second way you can do this is do it traditionally, right? Which is to either say, what do our confessions say? Or what does the early church do and the medieval church do, what has always been done. But it's also a modern sort of traditional thing. What has been done recently, what is common, what are we used to? And then a third sort of way we can start here is with utility, which is more common than people might like to think. That's when you start with, well, what would it do? Like, what are my fears of what could happen? Or what are my hopes of what it could bring, right? And so we're going to start in one of those three places. And I'm not saying which of those three congregationalism usually is, but as you can imagine, it's definitely not traditional. So, yeah.
But I would just want to throw in one point here. A lot of this is also grounded in how we define the church. And I think this is an important part, because one of the big debates that the Congregationalists will argue in favor of is they will say the locus of the church is in the congregation rather than in the synod or in the wider church organization. And so basically they say something along the lines of, at least in the Lutheran context, the church, the individual congregation, is where the word is proclaimed and the sacraments are administered, right? And that constitutes the church. And so a collection of those congregations then constitutes the big C church, or the synod, or what you will want to call it. But the Congregationalists would argue that that larger entity has no existence, truly, ontologically, outside of the congregations, because the larger entity is not the locus of proclamation. It's not the locus of the sacraments. So the Congregationalists will say the power should reside in the congregation because the word in the sacraments resides in the congregation. So I just want to make that theological point that the congregation.
Yeah, it's a good point, but I think we're still not there yet, because then you have the structure of how this all works, right? So starting with either God, tradition, or utility, then we have to ask questions like, what are the offices in the church? And that's where you get that question of, well, what is the church, right? Even what you said, and oftentimes they will start just where you started, but you can't actually start there. Because as you said, that's the congregation, because that's where the word and the sacraments are proclaimed. But as the Augustana says, the word and sacraments are only to be proclaimed and administered by who? One who's in the offices, right? And so you have to actually start with the offices. And so you have this question of how many offices, what are these offices? How do those offices work? Who grants the offices? How do people get into the offices? What does ordination look like? So you have all of these sorts of questions. And then you have, together with that, well, is the congregation, the laity, are they under or over the office? Who do they put the person in the office? Can they remove the person from the office? Do they judge the doctrine of the office? Or do they receive the doctrine of the office? You have all of these different sorts of questions. And so when we're talking about congregational polity, it's true. We are looking at people who are saying the congregation is the church proper. And I think even with the Episcopal people, most of them would largely agree with that statement. I think it's a largely non-controversial statement, aside from the last part of the synod has nothing to do with the church, right? But the big difference is in what the church is in its offices and how they function. Because for these Congregationalists, they're usually going to say, yeah, there is no such thing as a bishop. And I'll use some finger quotes here, because that's a controversial term, right? There's no such thing as a third office of bishop that oversees the congregations. There is just the pastor. And then you have, the deacons. And then whatever that is will often differ between tradition and tradition. But you will have these two offices, and then you'll have the laity. But for Congregationalists, there's not actually a whole agreement on how this works. Does a pastor put a pastor in the office of pastor? Or does the congregation put a pastor in the office of pastor? Can the pastors collectively remove a pastor? Or can only the congregation remove a pastor? And then do the other, like, how does that work? So, for example, if you look at Congregational Baptist churches, those laity run nothing. I don't know if people realize that. They fundamentally don't lead or run anything. They receive the word of God as it's taught from their local pastor. Their local pastor has total authority over that office and the administration of that office. But then if you look at many Congregational Lutheran synods, and I'll use a different example here. Let's go with the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. The pastor has no authority. I don't know if people realize this. The pastor fundamentally has no authority in his own congregation in that synod. You flip this on its head. You look at, for example, the Pietists in the Laestadian Lutheran Church. Do they have authority? Absolutely, they have authority, right? The congregation has authority to an extent, but it's under that of the pastor, right? And so there's even not total agreement within these congregational settings within Lutheranism itself. But that general shape of what makes them all united is that they would say the synod president or the bishop either doesn't exist or has no authority right here, right now, right? Only this one guy does. And so I want to also, point people to this kind of possible alert of a dangerous case of possible abuse. Not to say it's wrong, and this is not to play off of fear, because I don't think that we should do polity or ecclesiology off of fear. But if you remove any possible accountability from a pastor in the local context, the congregation can't hold him accountable. The bishop doesn't exist and can't hold him accountable. The other pastors in the synod won't hold him accountable. Nobody is holding him accountable. He's accountable only to God. Then how do you know what he's teaching is true? How do you know if he's leading you rightly? How does he know? He doesn't know, probably doesn't.
Well, and those are the most susceptible to descend into cults and cults of personality, which both of us have seen. And there are plenty of both contemporary and historical examples of that exactly happening, right? And, one of the things to ding the classic Congregationalist perspective of only the congregation has the authority to call the pastor, with due respect, the vast majority of congregants, I don't believe, have the discernment or the knowledge to basically properly discern who is fit for the office of ministry and who is not. There are the vast majority of congregations, quite frankly, I would not entrust with that task. A lot of them don't even know the basics of our confessions, which is sad. And that's a failure of, unfortunately, a lot of our predecessors in the pastoral office in general, that people have not been appropriately catechized. One of the things that I've intentionally done here is do a lot of catechetical studies, a lot of studies of the small catechism, as well as the wider Book of Concord, because my goal is that hopefully these people, when they serve on the call committee, at least have some sense of what they should be listening for, so that they don't choose somebody that isn't suitable. Now, conversely, in a point in favor of the Congregationalist, I have watched my local Roman Catholic parishes be destroyed by a bishop that put unsuitable priests into these congregations, and it split the communities, it's destroyed the communities, it's harmed the communities, because quite frankly, the bishop said, this is who's coming, and the congregation says, well, the parish says, well, we don't really like this guy. And the bishop says, well, I don't really care. And then the congregation is stuck with this priest who, may or may not be a good fit, or may just be to be honest, an awful priest. And then you're just stuck, right? Because some guy with a hat in Calgary told a church in Medicine Hat 3 hours away who they were going to have as their priest. So, I mean, I will defend congregationalism to an extent, at least in that regard, because I've watched it go wrong in the other way.
But then I will attack them again, because that can also go the other way, in which the laity are not educated enough to know. And this is even when they are catechized properly. They are not catechized well enough to know whether their complaints are valid or not. And people will not like to hear that, but it's true. In the same way that, for example, if I have a problem with my congregation, I'm supposed to tell my district president, and he's supposed to deal with that. Why? So that you can get a third eye on the matter. So that you can have a third party objective, not in the situation, to look at the situation and say whether or not these complaints are valid or real, rather than being stuck in the situation, whether for lack of education or because you're too close to the situation. Oftentimes, congregations will say, we don't like this pastor, and that's reason enough to not have him. That's not always the case, right? If he's teaching on unfit doctrine, this is not the problem of the congregations to solve, I don't think, but this would already be a failure of the synod at large. If they're presenting seminarians who are unfit, that's already a failure of the external church body, right? So you have all of these different sort of things that I think complicate this matter to the point such that our congregations need to be wholly receptive, right? They need to be able to judge doctrine, but I don't think that they need or should or can be standing above the pastoral office to say who they will and will not take on the basis of preference, right? And then if we say, well, if it's on the basis of doctrine, then the synod should not be sending them. And that the synod did send them means that they need to leave the synod, right? Like if your synod is that bad that it's sending like unfit people who aren't even teaching the small catechism correctly, that synod, it has to go. And then I do think that that's the point when the congregation needs to take that into their own hands. But that's a small catechism issue. And I think that that's a very easy bar for us to aim for our laity, to say, we desire that you would know absolutely perfectly the small catechism and be able to see like where it is and where it's not taught, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, there's also a degree to which, as you had pointed out earlier, a lot of our arrangements of polity are deeply utilitarian, right? And there's a degree to which there's our Platonic ideal, shall we say, of what the church should be or what we would like it to be, and then there's what it actually is. And there's always a tension between those two things, regardless of the system, regardless of the polity, right? And we both know this, right? I don't care what synod you're in, I don't care what association you're in, I don't care what congregation you're in, there is always a gap between what's on paper and what's actually done. And so I think there is something deeply practical about saying, as a standard, which I think is realistic and reasonable, you got to know your catechism, guys, at least your small catechism. It's not even that long. I don't actually think that's an unrealistic demand. And if a pastor is unwilling or unable to even do that, they're not suited for Lutheran ministry. Conversely, I think if you're in a congregationalist model, your call committee should be filled with people who know their catechism. And if they don't, they really shouldn't be on that call committee. You know, I don't think that's too crazy of a bar. I don't think that's too insane of a standard. I think that's really quite reasonable, all things told. And I think it's deeply practical as well for where we're actually at, because we both know that the vast majority of our congregation members are never going to read the Book of Concord from cover to cover. They never will. They don't care, they don't want to, and nothing will force them to. And so that's just the reality. But we can get most, if not all, of the people to at least read the small catechism.
I think it's very achievable, for sure.
Yes, it is achievable. And this is the great gift of our Lutheran heritage, is that small catechism. This tiny, precise theological gem that can be used as a wonderful regulating force and yardstick.
Yes. Now, as to, where the Congregationalists are finding this in the scriptures, we should, go over this now so that we can also look at the other ones back at this sort of centrifugal point where you have this idea of starting with the offices and then the way that the congregation is lent around it. You have in the text scripture, for example, 1 Timothy 3, he's laying out requirements for pastors to have that, right? And I think that, most of us do know them, right? If anyone aspires to the office of overseer or bishop, and this is probably going to come up again, right? He desires something noble, and he should be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, managing his household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. If someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert or may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. He must be well thought of by outsiders, and so on. And in other texts, you hear of Paul telling Timothy, and also, or maybe it's also in Titus, it's in one of them at least, talking about do not lay hands on another, that's an ordination hastily, right? So the power of making pastors is explicitly said to be in the pastoral office, not in a third office, which doesn't exist within the biblical text. I'll just lay my hands out on the table there, right? There is the way that the scriptures are using the term bishop is of the office pastor. And I'll lay another card here on the table. When it speaks of elders, it's also speaking of pastors in the same way. It's used as an interchangeable term. And neither of these are an office separate from pastor. They are both the same office. All three of these terms are the same office according to scripture. And that office is made by the pastor. But in the way that the Bible describes the way that this takes place, it says that the apostles are presenting a selection of men for the congregation to vote upon. And so the congregation does have some say, not none, but it's not saying, okay, who do you think would be a good guy for this office? The clergy are presenting men that they think are ready. And then the congregation is voting on it. And then the clergy are laying hands on those men to make them pastors. So this is not a wholly clerical or a wholly lay-led issue. This is the clergy and the laity coming together to produce the situation that we see in the scriptural text, right? But and this is a total condemnation of the Congregationalists. When the Bible speaks of laity, it tells them to submit to the clergy, totally. There is no text which says if you don't like your pastor, kick him out, right? There is one which says test the scriptures, right? That's not bad to do, right? But when it talks about those who are stewards of the mysteries of God, those who have care for your souls, submit to them and honor them, right? As you would a spiritual father, as our confessions say in the Large Catechism on the Fourth Commandment. So this is what the biblical texts say. Do you have anything to say about the biblical text before we look at another polity format?
No, I think, in interest of time, we should just start moving towards the other polity format.
All right.
I think so far, all is well. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's look at, do you want to look at the middle one or the other extreme?
Let's do the extremes.
All right. Well, obviously, then you have Episcopal polity, right? And you have this in multiple forms. You have this in obviously that traditional Catholic, canonical, apostolic succession, the blah, 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 where the three guys touch the one guy and then he becomes a special guy. And then this is, interestingly enough, the scholars of the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches do not believe that this existed from the earliest times in the church. They believe that this is a historical development, not in scripture anywhere. And they fully admit that. So why we would think that this is so important, I fundamentally don't know. Again, as you said, it's very obvious many of us are thinking utilitarian along those lines. And I think these people are, but I think they're also thinking on traditional lines and mending those two or blending them and saying, well, this will work better if you centralize the authority, it will be cleaner. Maybe they're also thinking along the lines of exemplarist thought in God, saying, well, he's an image of God, as you find in, for example, Clement and Ignatius and Irenaeus and these three epistles that are talked about all the time in regard to Episcopal polity. Look at how much the early church loved Episcopal polity. I think that that's true to an extent. However, I don't think that, except for the one guy who says that he just received this miraculously from the Holy Spirit and didn't receive this from men, I think we should probably read that line a little more closely, as the Gottesdienst podcast has said we should read that more closely. But this is definitely the extreme. You do have a sort of softening of that in a lot of Lutheran contexts, though. For example, in NALC, which you're also in, they have a bishop, but not one of these canonical three guys touching the one guy to make him a special guy. And the only ordinations which are real are ones that are touched by a guy who is touched by three guys, right? This is not the case, right? It's that let's have a synod president and call him this term of bishop. Again, the term bishop means pastor. So I think personally, if someone said to me, like with the LCC overture, should we call the synod president bishop? And I said, yes, because that's what he is. He is not a president of anything. He is a pastor. So we should call him the synod pastor, the synod bishop. I think that's totally fine. The presiding pastor is fine too. These are all the same word. But when we start saying it's a third office, it's distinct in the mind of God, then I think that we have no basis to really say that, except this one guy, obviously I reverence the church fathers, but who straight up says he doesn't know of this in any other human being. He just downloaded this from God. I think that's pretty sus.
Well, that's literally what Luther called enthusiasm, right? And funny how that works, right? I always get a kick out of those people. Like those people are no better than Joseph Smith or any other false prophet. Oh, God revealed to me alone, and I have no verifiable proof, and conveniently it benefits my own position. It's like, oh, well, that's nice, right? All of that stuff should just be thrown in the trash. The minute somebody tries to do that, it's like that one meme that went around where the footnote was, this was revealed to me in a dream. It's like, okay, I don't care. Like, sorry. But one of the things I just want to say about the Episcopal polity in its canonical sense, in its strictest sense, one of the things that I have to give it credit for is it often enforces very good unity. It's clear who's in charge, which often is good when things start to get messy. I envy the fact that if there's a huge problem in a congregation, a bishop can just roll up in the extreme version of this and just solve the problem and say, well, this is what we're doing, done. Now, conversely, I think, as we all know, if you look through medieval history, if you look through contemporary history, this over-centralized power has been used by wicked and sinful men to do horrible things, and to do great wickedness and to introduce error into the church. As I often remind the people who like to stand for this policy or for this polity is, bishops didn't save the ELCIC. Bishops didn't save the Anglican Church. Bishops certainly as heck didn't save the Roman Church or the Eastern Church, right? That doesn't mean they have no value. That doesn't mean there weren't good bishops. That's not what I'm saying. There's very fine bishops, but there's also been very wicked ones, and there's been very little recourse to do anything about this. And we look at, this is exactly Luther's problem at the start of the Reformation. When he saw the indulgences being paid for and going around and all the scams of that, and he wrote to the Bishop of Rome, assuming the bishop was going to do his job, that he was a good man, that he knew his Bible, that he was a pious man, and he was going to correct this. But what Luther didn't know was that was the bishop behind it all. He was the one that put his stamp on these sales so that he could build an even more fabulous basilica, not for God, but for himself. Pope Leo de' Medici, if you're familiar with the small little banking family in Italy, who purchased his position, which was simony, who allowed other bishops to purchase their positions, and all sorts of corruption. Unbelievable. Like, it doesn't take long to read this. And so we see horrible corruption, doctrinal error coming through these models. And I cannot help but think of what Lord Acton said, is sort of, and this line is overused, but power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so when you put these people above everyone else and they have no accountability except them and God, it's very easy for wicked people to wile their way into those positions and introduce wickedness into the church and depravity and doctrinal error of all sort. So that is one of the things that I think I personally struggle with that. And part of that is colored by my own experiences where I've personally witnessed horrific abuse of power.
Yeah, from my perspective, just working off of this quote, power corrupts and absolute power absolutely corrupts. I actually don't think that it's true, for the reason that absolute power exists in God and is from God and in God. And even in Romans 13, if you think of the table of duties, there, I almost said Luther, but their God, through Paul, is writing about authority, and he says authority, just swap that term with power. It comes from God. And it's true that it can be wielded by bad men, but this is not outside of the vision of God and the purpose of God, whatever that might be, right? So when we see this in Romans 13, and this is of a government that's persecuting Christians, Paul doesn't say, well, we can't have kings anymore, because some of them are bad. What he actually says is, everyone that's in the position of authority has that position from God, therefore submit, because he's the minister of God. He says that actually, I think it's 3 or 4 times in that passage. It's beautiful. It's poetic. And it's of a thing that's technically awful. I'll give you another one, just if people aren't upset enough. When Paul speaks of slaves, he says, slaves, submit to your masters. He doesn't say, oh my goodness, this dynamic of power is really abusive. It is. And he says, submit to it, right? Because there you're going to image forth the cross of Jesus Christ. And so when, again, this goes back to that utilitarian thing. And I everybody knows that I don't have a utilitarian bone in my body. I am, Platonism on caffeine. I am very dangerous. I understand that. But when people say things like, well, if you let this position have all authority, it could go bad, I'm not thinking, oh no, it could go bad, but rather, oh, maybe we will have a chance to image forth the cross of Christ. Maybe we will be able to bear the wounds of Christ in our life as we suffer under an awful government, under an awful employer, under awful circumstances. And people say, you can't allow that to happen. Well, it's not me who is to decide this. I'm not Bonhoeffer. I'm not going to go and assassinate Hitler, right? Because that's wrong to do. However, when we think, for example, that only things working out is good and godly, then I don't think we actually understand the point of these, what the church would call schools of virtue or arenas of spiritual warfare, right? When we get into a marriage, we don't say you need to make sure that you, for example, only love a good man and only ever submit to a good husband, and of the husbands that you only ever love a faithful wife. Read the book of Hosea. My goodness, this is the exact opposite. And what's said of it, it's extremely divine. It's extremely divine. It images God's love for his people. And so when we say, like, what's actually good, the answer is always going to be that which images God. And so for those in authority, that's going to be their task to be the best rulers that they can be, whether that's in the church or in the home or in the state or in the workplace. And of those who are under it, it's their job to submit to that, right? And so, and in doing so, not just be the recipient of love, but also, if they are suffering, to image forth the cross. And so in a way, I would say, like, this, regardless of what it is, because even congregationalist polity, this whole thing about power corrupting. And while I don't think that power corrupts myself, I do think that a lack of power or power in the universal also corrupts, just because people are corrupt. I don't think that power corrupts, because you can't corrupt people. They already suck maximally, right? There's I'll give a contrasting example here, and this is not my words, but it's from I forget what religion he is. He's one of these, like, spiritual leaders in one of these South Asian religions, and he says democracy is government of the people, by the people, for the people. But he says the problem of the people, again, not my words but his, he says the problem is that the people are retarded, right? And it's true, right? How has democracy gone? People would say, oh, it's going very well. We have TVs, we have cars, we have this and that. Yeah, and your kids are going to hell. And your son is now your daughter, and you don't have any meaning in your life. And you only live for making money. So, how have we gotten to the place where everybody just takes abortion for granted, or transgenderism for granted, or homosexuality for granted, or just war is now just killing anybody because they wanted you to speak a different dialect? Now, where does all of this come from? Well, it comes from just the mass populace as this giant herd of sheep leading themselves, as the blind leading the blind. I don't think that we're seeing God in the rejection of Romans 13, or in the rejection of the pastoral authority, or in the rejection of leadership in the home. I think that all we're seeing is a bunch of stupid people and blind people and deaf people leading themselves into the pits of deep darkness, right? And I don't think that, like, when we say, well, it's better than if one blind guy led us in the pit of darkness. I'm like, no, you're just doing the same thing, right? At least if we have an authority structure that exemplifies love, then at least we can exemplify love along the way, and love will maybe guide us, right? Love will maybe guide us. And this is what Paul says about these marriages. When one is an unbeliever, stick with them. Maybe love will lead them.
And one of the things that, is 100% in favor of this is nothing beats a great king or a great bishop, right? We remember these people through the centuries. And there's something to be said about that. King Solomon and King David will be remembered forever. King Alfred the Great will be remembered forever, right? All these people, or the great bishops, Gregory the Great, will be remembered forever. John Chrysostom will be remembered forever. And these are faithful people, great people that brought honor to the calling, the vocation that God had placed them in, and showed all men what could be, right? And so they become signs and symbols of the inbreaking of the new and the overcoming. They become
Calvinist sacraments.
Yeah, they become, exactly. And so don't get me wrong. I mean, this is why, as much as I like to rail against the abuses of Episcopal polity, I personally have a tendency to be more in that direction, because I think a free-for-all has never led somewhere good. And quite frankly, I shudder to think of some of the people that are granted voting rights in congregational polity that have no idea what they're talking about and no idea what they believe, and yet they get to determine leadership and doctrine.
Yeah, I think the scariest thing about this, and this is the last thing that I'll say about Episcopal polity, is that, a congregational polity, is that the only thing that I'm convinced those people believe is that they will not submit to any ruling authority. And that's what voting, that to me, that's, as far as I could tell, that's what voting is. In the government, in the church, in anything, where it happens, it is your say that you believe everybody else should hear. And if the masses vote a different way, I have zero faith that you will actually submit to it respectfully. That's my personal opinion.
Well, because they worship autonomy. And we even see this, I think this is ultimately what will break democracy, is because the reality is democracy is consent of the losers. And I firmly believe eventually the losers will stop consenting.
Yeah, I think that that's true. But, this also, it goes back to that earlier thing when I said Episcopal polity only works when the heart of both parties is right. We know how that works with leaders, but with those submitting to, it's, you say that bishop can walk in on one Sunday and fix all the problems. That's true, but only true. And this is why people say, well, Episcopal polity is just top down. It's not. The top has to submit. That's an active work. If those laity don't receive the words of the bishop and submit to them and believe them and follow them, then you automatically have congregational polity in that minute. Though you have a pope or a bishop standing in the room, if you will not hear his words, then you might as well have a congregationalist polity. If you only submit to words from your ecclesial supervisor that you agree with, then you already have a congregational polity in your heart. And that's what congregational polity is an active rejection of authority to the utmost. And because these authorities are from God and in God and reflect God and are empowered by God, that is a rejection of God himself, which is what Paul says in Romans 13. We can't not apply it both ways. So that, I'll stop talking about that because we are also running out of time. I want to talk now about the middle position, which is called, oftentimes just called synodical polity or sometimes presbyterial polity. And in many cases, people will say this is, what the LCC has now, or some will say this is not what the Missourians have, this is what WELS have. It's really irrelevant. But the picture here is, again, it's not that you have one centralized clerical authority, but it's not that you have lay authority. You have decentralized universal clerical authority over the laity. That's what the situation is supposed to be, as it's written on paper, right? So you have whether we're talking just pastors or whether we're talking pastors and deacons, and maybe we can talk a little bit just quickly about what deacons are. But biblically, what deacons are is the church council. That's very obvious in Acts 6, right? And it is not a special office that you get by going through a deaconess program where you learn to do counseling. That is not what it is either. And it is not a parish nurse. I'm sorry if that needs to be said. You can say that's what it is in your synod. That's definitely true, but that's not what it is biblically. Nobody except the laity are under a confusion about this, right? Biblically speaking, the church council is the diaconate, right? Those are the people doing the tasks that are laid out in Acts chapter 6. So whether this presbyterial polity or synodical polity is the clergy as understood as the pastors or the clergy as understood as the pastors and the deacons leading the congregations is irrelevant, so long as what we understand is that the people leading it are educated, called by God, and ordained by the church, by the voting and the consent of the congregation. And those are the people that are leading it. Then you have much more, in my opinion, you have much more pliability in the congregation because they've already voted for you, right? They know you, and they know that you have the backing of everybody else, right? And so there's a working together to bring the top down to the bottom and the bottom up to the top, so that you have a closer readiness to submit, not from some guy in a pointy hat they've never met, right? But from the guys that are most close to them in their district or their diocese or their circuit or whatever you call it in your synod, as well as their pastor that's there, working together with those brothers all the time, right? To make sure that he's not ruling alone or pastoring alone, but that it's a team effort and that's just the guy they know, but they probably know a few other guys, and they've probably seen them, and that gives a face to the policies and to the words.
Well, and this is the system that I've tended to come towards myself, because I think and I'm more utilitarian than you are, I think it's a happy medium. I like the fact that even the highest authorities have someone to answer to in the church. Conversely, I like the fact that those higher authorities actually have authority. And I think that's, once again, these mixed polities aren't perfect either. I won't deny it. I even look at the NALC's constitution, and sometimes it's confusing, and sometimes there's areas where it's like, is this really going to work? Because it's not always clear sometimes who's in charge of something. Is the congregation in charge? Is the executive in charge? Who's in charge here? And there are some gray areas, but I think at least in the NALC, and I know the LCC and LCMS and WELS have had much longer trying to hammer this out in their own context, but the NALC
and they still are.
Yeah, well, and the NALC is still, quite frankly, a baby synod, so it's still trying to figure a lot of these things out. But what I like about it is there seems to be a clear sense of accountability and authority, and it's not a free-for-all, and there's actual standards that can actually be enforced. And I think for me, from a pragmatic utilitarian perspective, that's what I want to see. There's real standards, there's a real set of core beliefs, and it's really enforceable. That's what I want out of a polity, whatever the polity is. That's what I want.
It's interesting that you say that this works well with like utilitarian starting point or guideline or qualification. And while I'm not a utilitarian guy, I do think it's interesting that you say that, because as I look at what I have written down here on my piece of paper, where we talked about the starting points. Do we start with God? Do we start with what's traditional? Do we start with what's utilitarian? Well, as you say, this does work very perfectly well with utilitarian aspects, right? This does draw a happy medium. It does have authority. It does have submission, but it also has accountability. And it also has the willingness and consent of the congregations. But at the same time, this polity is exactly what you find in the scriptures without any debate. And this is what was used by the earliest churches without any debate. This is what everybody agrees upon, right? You had a plurality of pastors and one was presiding over them, but not as a third office, right? And thus it is also traditional. It is biblical. It reflects God in both ways. It is traditional, right? And this is also found within what you find in the confessions as well. Because even though the confessions say you need to, if possible, retain the episcopacy, it also likewise says it's not necessary to do so, but what is necessary is that the laity submit to the pastors, and that the pastors are not there, especially if you go beyond just the Book of Concord, go into, for example, the letter to the nobility, right? Those pastors are there with the call of the congregation, right? Now, this is a break with that canonical Episcopal polity. And also that break is severed sharply in the Book of Concord when it says, this is not by divine right. This is not absolutely necessary. This is not necessary for valid ordination. All of these things are stated there. So with this sort of middle polity, you have all agreements between scripture, between confessions, between the earliest churches, between also what works and what's utilitarian. But for me, when I think about this, I really am thinking about, like, it has to be biblical. Like, we can't just be making up definitions of offices that disagree with the scriptures, right? If the Bible is telling me that the diaconate, for example, are the people who are taking care of the money and the grounds of the church, and also helping with, to feed the widows, after church in the fellowship hall, I'm not going to say, actually, no, it's not them. It's people who went to seminary for 4 years to learn how to do Sunday school. Like, I don't have the authority to just make that up, in my opinion. Right, I'm gonna stick with the text. And if, for example, someone says, well, the synod president should be called bishop, and you're not a bishop, and also he should have a lifetime office, and I'm not at all against actually the lifetime office, but like that whole idea, then I would say, on what grounds? Because biblically speaking, a bishop is a pastor of a local congregation.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where we have to ultimately ground ourselves, right? And I think it's so important to get rid of the noise of, well, we're not going to do it because they do it this way, and we've always done it this way, so we're going to do it this way. Or, like, let's look at what the text actually says and not be reactionaries and not be revolutionaries, right? And at the end of the day, the old adage remains correct. The proper response to abuse is not disuse, but correct use. And what I like to see is there seems to be a trend of the church correcting herself through the power of the Holy Spirit and the Word, of course, to that, because there is, even among the evangelicals, there is a sense that, wait a minute, we can't just all be islands unto ourselves, right? We can't just do whatever, every congregation can't just do its own thing. And that is a fascinating trend to watch, especially when you see it as a movement born out of the rejection of authority. And I think a lot of this polity question does come down to, and I think you hit the nail on the head here when you were talking about this, is a lot of people really, especially in the modern West, where individual autonomy and personal choice and free will are sacrosanct, they don't like the idea of anyone telling them no or telling them a different way than they feel is correct. Because I know even at the congregational level, when the congregation votes on something, the people who disagree, some are gracious about it and say, okay, well, I'm on board with the rest of the congregation. But there's always some that are bitter about it forever. And they think their position was the righteous one and was the one that should have been selected. And everyone else is just, unfortunately, an idiot or evil because they didn't vote the way they thought. And nothing, even God himself, will not bind them to a decision that they did not consent to.
Amen. Well, we thank everybody for joining us, and make sure that you all declare yourselves your local pope and visit Pope Bishop John down the street at the local Baptist church and tell him that he needs to submit to the Pope of Alexandria, Egypt, or else he will perish eternally, and all the other crazy hot takes that you could possibly invent on the spot. And join us next month, when we will discuss something else that is interesting. God be praised. Amen.
Amen.